Good afternoon. I have a quick question for you. Have you ever had one of those moments in your life where something happened and you really thought that you knew exactly which direction that was going to take you down, and the Lord had completely opposite plans for you in the long run? Well, today I'm going to share a story with you about myself that's very much like that. Something happened in my life that I was quite sure was going to take me down one path, and it actually led me down a completely different path. In 2011, my father passed away from an illness called pulmonary fibrosis. Now, what that is the illness that basically turns your lungs into concrete and you suffocate. Now, this was a very quick illness. He was diagnosed about a year and a half before that. And in that year and a half, his health progressed fairly rapidly. And he died in 2011, as I said. Now, I'll preface this by saying that I was brought up in the church. I was raised to be a believer. I was raised to trust in God and believe that He's sovereign in all things. And when my dad passed away, I got very, very angry. My dad was a godly man. He was my hero. He was somebody that I trusted and believed in. And when he got as ill as he did and died as quickly as he did, it upset me. And I was quite sure that this was going to drive me away from God. But what it did, surprisingly enough, is it led me to start questioning the reasons that we suffer, the reasons that people that we know are good people and are godly people have to go through the trials that they do. I searched the scriptures, I read books, I talked to people that I knew, and I just didn't know why. And I kept searching and searching and searching, and I read the story of Job, where God allowed Satan to tempt him with trials, even though Job was, even in God's own word, he was a good man. He was a righteous man. Now, I'm not trying to say my father was perfect or that he was a righteous man, but he was a good, godly man. And in my mind, allowing him to suffer like this was difficult for me to understand. And it certainly didn't make me feel closer to God. But as I went through this process and as I began to study this and why God does, I began to come to the realization that God allows us to suffer, or allows suffering to happen to us, should I say, so that we can be drawn closer to Him. And there are sections of the Bible and parts where it specifically talks about that we as believers should be ready to suffer for the sake of Christ and in the name of what God's done for us. And as I began to study about why God allowed my father to suffer, I began to realize that I had never actually suffered for anything. I'd never suffered for the sake of Christ. I'd never suffered in His name or because of who He was or what He'd done for me. And I called myself a believer. And through this process, God really began to change my heart and to shape and to mold me into something that He was going to turn me into. And it was during this time that I began to hear His voice calling me to vocational ministry. Now, this was a very odd thing for me, and it challenged me in many ways. So what I did was I started to seek out people that would tell me that I had lost my mind, that I didn't know what I was talking about, that there's no way God had called me to ministry. And every single person that I talked to just confirmed that calling. They confirmed that what I knew was right, and what I was hearing was God's voice telling me that my father's death was not in vain, that it was going to lead me down a path that would lead me to become a pastor, to serve at a church at some point. I confirmed the calling with my wife, who suggested that I go back to college, or that I go to college, which I'd never been before. And I did that. I enrolled at LeTourneau University, and I began to work part-time as a staff member at the church that I attended. And my calling has been confirmed over and over and over again as I move closer and closer to my goal of being a pastor at some point in the very near future. So I guess in the end, what it really struck me with was that God can take the things that seem the worst in our life and turn them into something that serves His purpose in a mighty and powerful way. My father's death, which I thought was going to lead me a path away from God, actually drew me closer to God and moved me beyond the faith that I thought I'd had before, down a path that God had laid out for me long before the beginning of time, which was a very comforting thought to me. So if you've ever gone through a situation like this, or if you're going through a situation like this, I would encourage you to really look and see what God has for you in these moments, because they are not simply suffering for no cause. God has a reason for it. And I can certainly, through this story that I just told you, attest to the fact that if you listen to Him, He'll lead you down the path He wants you to go. Thanks so much. Have a good evening.